Hello again, welcome back to another video. If you're new here, my name is Emily and I make lots of art related videos. In this video I'm finally getting round to showing you how I collage. I show myself collaging in a lot of videos and I always get questions about how I collage, if I could go into more detail, and the time has finally come, the video is here. I know some people have been waiting quite a long time for this, so I hope it lives up to expectations. Here you can just see some collages I've done in the past. Thought I'd just show you some bits and bobs that I've done. In this video I'm just doing one collage, but it's quite a big one of a landscape because I assume that's what most people are interested in. But obviously I've done lots of different collage related things. I'm going to go through everything step by step and also show you how I paint the paper to actually collage with, because that's something which I actually never show. I just appear with all this paper already painted to use and I never actually show how I do it. I feel like I've just scraped the surface with this video of what I can talk about. I have a lot more to say, so I have plans to make more videos in the future over on Skillshare because I think that would be a really good platform to do it on. So yeah, I'll make them in the future, going over how I collage different things and go into as much detail as I possibly can, because like I said, I'm scraping the surface with this video. There's a lot to say about it. Starting off with what you'll need. A lot of this is self-explanatory, but I thought I'd go through it just in case. The bare minimum you'll need is some paint, scissors, paintbrush, glue stick and paper. The paper I'm using is just plain old printer paper, nothing fancy. Mine just so happens to be from Sainsbury's, but you can get it from anywhere and use just whatever you have available really. You do not need fancy paper to do this. For the paint I'm using acrylic paint. Mine is by the brand Winsor & Newton, but again, just use what you have. I have a lot of colours as you can see, but you do not need this many colours. For white paint, I just buy the cheap of the cheap, big tubes of it, because I go through it so quickly, it just makes sense to buy the bigger tubes. Plus it's pretty good paint. Scissors, I have lots of different scissors which all cut a little bit differently, but I'll talk about that a little bit later on in the video. For paintbrushes, I recommend big brushes because you don't want to be faffing about trying to paint a big sheet of paper with a tiny little brush. So yeah, the bigger the better, I say. A little extra bonus you can have are pencils and crayons or like oil pastels. These can be really good to add little details to your collage, or they also work well for slightly changing the colour of a piece of paper and adding extra texture. So yeah, they come in handy, but you do not need them. And finally, a glue stick. You can also use like PVA if you want, but glue sticks are just much easier to use. I use the brand Pritt Sticks, but just use whatever you have. And finally, organisation. Again, you do not need this, but if you get as collage obsessed as me and you have lots and lots of paper, it makes sense to just colour organise it. Otherwise you spend so long searching for a bit of paper in a big box. I've been there. Just save your time and get it organised. I got these from WH Smith and I have it all colour coded and it just really speeds things up. I recommend one with a elastic closure, because then no matter how much paper you stuff in it, you can still close it because the elastic will just stretch. So yeah, that's everything you'll need. Okay, so moving on now to how I paint the paper which I use for my collages. I say 99% of the paper I use is just painted with acrylic like I'm showing you in this video. Occasionally I will use different bits of paper that I just find lying about, or sometimes with an interesting bit of paper with some nice texture I'll just keep it. But yeah, 99% is just made from what I'm doing now. I use acrylic because, well, it's just what I have. I like the textures it makes, but you can use whatever paint you have. I do recommend acrylic because, well, personally it's just what I like the look of. But again, it's your collage, do what you want. If you want to use gouache or watercolour, or you can even just colour in the bits of paper with pencil, or you do what you want to do, but this is just what I do. So as you can see, I'm I'm just painting some paper with some colours. I mix the colour pretty much primarily on the paper. I don't do much mixing on the palette. I just slap on the colour and just mix it on the paper. I use a lot of water. You can't really see here in this video, but I have a mug full of water which I'm constantly dipping into because it helps the paint spread a bit easier, and it makes the paint a little bit transparent, which I kind of want sometimes because it just, I don't know, makes the colours mix nicer. I often dip into water. Yeah, you can use like different amount of water will make a different sort of look. The cheaper the paper, I found when you add lots of water to really cheap printer paper, it'll go a little bit splotchy, but I quite like the way that looks. So just bear that in mind if you are using pretty cheap paper like me. If you drench it in water, it will get like these sort of spots on it, but again, like I said, I want that to happen. I like the little spots it makes. I do occasionally mix the colours on the palette if I want a specific shade, but yeah, most of the time it is just mixed directly on the paper, and I use different sort of techniques to create different textures. My main go-to textures are dry brushing, which is where you basically want very little amount of paint on your brush, so when you're painting you get loads of the white showing through. I mean, I'm sure you know what dry brushing is, but on top of this pink, I'll dry brush a darker colour on top. I do this quite a lot. I'll paint a base colour and then go on top of it with another colour to add dry brushing on top, and I really like the texture that makes. Another thing I'll do, which you'll see, splatter in the paint. I get a lot of water onto the brush, mixed with obviously with a little bit of paint, and just splatter away. I quite like the look of when you paint a dark colour and then splatter a lighter colour on top. I think that looks really good, but also I'll splatter dark on top of light, and sometimes I'll splatter colours and then paint a thin, like a really watered down paint on top so you can see the splatters underneath. Sometimes I will paint with really wet paint and then splatter on top like immediately after, so you'll kind of get wet on wet and the splatters will kind of interact in a different way and spread out a little bit. Lots you can do with splattering. I really like the way splatters look. The main advice I'll give for doing this is to just don't think about it. Just turn off your brain and splatter some paint down. The more you think about it, the less loose it will be, and probably, you know, you won't really get the results you're looking for. And in the moment when I'm doing these, I'm thinking to myself, oh, I'm not really sure about how these textures are turning out. I don't really know if I like this one. But then 9 times out of 10, at the end of it, I'll be like, oh, you know what, these textures are pretty good actually. And even if you don't like a texture you've made in the moment, you never know, a couple months down the line you might be making a collage where it'll come in really handy and it's like the perfect thing you need. If this is your first time collaging and you really want to get into it, I recommend just painting as many as you can and just doing every single colour you can think of, and just, I'd say maybe paint at least 40, so then you just have them, and then you can just collage loads of stuff from that. This actual process of me painting paper, I really don't do very often. I'll do it once every few months because I'll do so much paper that I don't need to do it for ages. It just makes sense that whilst you have your paints out, you might as well just do loads, so then you don't really have to do it again for a while. When I go into it, I do have certain colours in mind that I want. For this, I knew what picture I was referencing for the collage, so I knew in my head, right, I'm going to need a lot of green and a lot of blue because the picture I'm collaging has water and a lot of grass, so that was top of the list. Make some nice greens and some nice blues, and then, you know, some colours for buildings, and then everything else I'll just do for a bit of fun because I might need it in the future. So I go into it with certain colours in mind, but when I am actually doing it, I just think to myself, right, I need maybe a light blue, a dark blue, a few different shades of blue. Same goes with like green and all the other colours that I specifically want, but then other than that, I'm just turning my brain off and I'm just splattering paint. I recommend putting some paper underneath because it will get very, very messy, so just make sure you've protected your table underneath, that way you can paint to the edge of the paper and you're getting more use out of your paper. But yeah, here are all the papers that I did. Lots and lots. I probably used about maybe 10 of these in total. Yeah, a lot of this is just going straight into the collaging folder to use in future things, but it's just nice to have them. There's around 40 sheets here, and I remember rightly it took me around 40 minutes, so that's averaging, you know, a minute per sheet. So it really doesn't take long to paint these. Yeah, I just spread them all out on my bedroom floor as I'm doing it, so I'm like surrounded in paper, and they really don't take long to dry either because it's acrylic. Take maybe 10 minutes to dry in total. Quite a quick task really, considering how much paper you get out of it. Before we get into the main collage section of this video, I wanted to quickly mention my Etsy shop. I have an Etsy shop. If you didn't know, I'll link it in the description if you want to have a little nosy. You can buy prints of my work as well as cute little stickers. If you like the look of my collages, I sell lots of prints which I've collaged as well as paintings as well. I put a lot of work into it. I recently did a shop update, so there's lots of stuff on there, and I'll be restocking some prints which have sold out in the next week. So yeah, if you want to have a nosy, it's linked in the description. Getting on with the collage. Okay, so you've painted all your paper and now it's time to finally start collaging. I'll pop up on screen right now the pictures I'm using as reference. This is some pictures I took on holiday in a little town in Cornwall. I've got two pictures here which I kind of mashed together, but you'll see at the end I also change it a lot and add my own things to it. The picture's just there kind of as a base, and I'll sort of make it up as I go really. To start off a collage, it can be very scary and daunting, but you just gotta get started. What I do to start is I'll just have a quick look through all the papers that I've painted and just try and find specific colours that I want and just kind of set them aside. So I'll flip through, try and find the shades I'm wanting, the colours I'm wanting, and then after I've done that I'll look through the pile again for specific little bits within that paper which I like the look of. So I'm looking for maybe bits where two colours join and look quite nice next to each other, or some bits with interesting texture, and then I'll just really loosely cut out that shape, making sure to give myself enough room around the edges. It can be very easy to get quite precious about the paper you've painted, and you'll be a bit cautious thinking, oh, I don't want to cut out a shape and then waste it because I quite like this paper. But you need to get rid of that mindset and just accept that half the shapes you cut out you probably won't end up using. But just because you don't use it in this specific collage, you never know, a few collages down the line you might think, oh wow, this shape I cut out ages ago is now perfect. So yeah, try not to be too precious about the paper, especially because, you know, well, the paper I'm using is super cheap and really didn't take me that long to paint. So yeah, just get yourself stuck into it. The hardest part of a collage is starting, because you've just got this blank paper looking at you and all these sheets. I often say, oh, it's like making a jigsaw, but you have no pieces and you have to make the pieces yourself, and also you have no idea what the finished result will look like. So it's an extremely difficult jigsaw is what collaging is doing. So as you can see, it's a lot of trial and error. I'm just ripping up bits of paper, testing them next to each other, seeing if they work, seeing what I like. I'm just playing around at this stage. What's nice about collage is you never have to commit to anything until you kind of fully stick it down. So I'll play around with stuff, moving it around, seeing what I like, setting shapes aside, bringing them back in, maybe ripping them slightly, just moving them around until I find something which I like. So that requires a lot of trial and error, so just prepare yourself for that. Collage is 80%, maybe even 90% just trial and error, moving shapes around until you find something which works. After I've found something which I'm somewhat happy with, I'll do what I refer to as a loose stick, which is where I'll put a tiny blob of glue right in the centre of the shape and stick it down just so it's not jiggling around anymore, but the edges of the shape like not glued at all, and I can easily rip the shape back up if I want it. It's a nice way to get something stuck down, so it's easier to work on top of without having to commit to anything, because you can easily just rip it back up again. As you can see, yeah, things are barely stuck down. It just means stuff isn't like, you know, moving around and I'm like losing shapes. Even when I do this, sometimes I'll rip shapes back up again, or go back in and slightly alter a shape and rip it at the edges. Yeah, what's nice about collage is how easy it is to change things, and that's probably what I like about it most. I find collage a very stress-free thing to do, because there's no commitment. If you don't like something or something doesn't really turn out the way you wanted it, just rip it up or cut a new shape. Although it is very tricky and hard to especially get started, I think the ease of not having to commit to anything definitely outweighs the cons. Once you have a bit of a base down, I find it's much easier to then build shapes on top of it. As you can see here, I've got the kind of the sea down, and now I'm working on, I don't know what it's called, the harbour, the wall around the sea. And you can see like every shape I'm cutting is just really simple. It's either a rectangle or a ripped out little blob. They're really simple shapes. Sometimes you do have to cut a slightly more complicated shape, especially if you're doing like animals or flowers, but obviously I'm not really covering that in this video. But most of the time you can just make it up out of rectangles and just random little shapes I've found. That's like my personal taste, but obviously you might prefer more complicated shapes when you're collaging. This is just something I found I prefer the look of when I'm doing a collage. Like for example, this harbour that I'm cutting out, as you can see it's all like kind of made of the same colour, and if I would have cut that all out of one piece of paper, first off it would have been quite complicated to cut it to the right size, and then also it wouldn't have that much texture to it because it would have all been cut out of the same piece of paper. I like to cut it all out of different bits of texture so that when I join it together, first off it's a little bit wobbly and higgledy-piggledy because I'm kind of joining all these shapes together which are all a bit different in size, and also all these shapes have loads of different textures on them, so it just helps break up what could have been quite a big boring shape by making it out of different shapes and bringing them together to make the bigger shape. Yeah, I think it looks better and it's easier to do. For example, the sea, I could have just cut that out of one big sheet of paper and stuck that down, but instead I made it out of however many shapes is it, what is it, like 7 shapes there that I ripped it out of, all slightly different shades and different textures. Yeah, so that's another tip. If you have a big shape you want to stick and cut down, I recommend ripping it up a bit, cutting it out of slightly different colours and then sticking it back together. It'll just make it look a little bit more interesting. When I'm doing a collage, when I'm looking at the reference picture that I'm using, I'm kind of breaking it down, well especially for landscapes, this doesn't really apply to anything else, but if I'm doing a landscape I'm looking at the mid, well the fore, the mid and the background, and I'm using that to help me figure out how to layer the shapes on top of each other. Obviously it makes sense to stick down the background before you stick all the extra little details on top of it, because I've been there where I've stuck down all these lovely little shapes, then I realised, hold on, I could do with sticking something underneath this and having to rip them all back up again and stick them back down. Just, yeah, makes sense like I've done here with the green. Stick the green down first so you have the base and then do all your little fiddly bits on top of it. Yeah, it's just a nice order to do it in. You've probably noticed by now that I do a lot of ripping. I just rip the paper. I also, cut shapes as well, but I also really enjoy to rip the paper because when you rip it, depending on the direction you rip it in, you can either get a nice white line along the edge, or if you rip it in another direction you get a wobbly edge without the white line from the paper, and I'll do different things depending on what I want, but I find that little white edge you get when you rip the paper can work really well to just slightly separate colours out. For example, here you can see underneath the ladder I have a little white line in between the brown of the wall and the blue of the sea, and without that white line those colours would be really similar to each other and kind of blend into one, but by ripping the paper I've created a little divide between the two, which I think looks nice. I don't do this all the time. Sometimes if you have too many little white edges everywhere, it kind of loses its effect. Also, I don't rip everything, even though I really enjoy the way the rip looks. If everything's ripped, then it's no longer really that special anymore, so I always try to add a mixture of ripped edges and straight edges from the scissors. This is just what I found I personally really like, but obviously when you're collaging you'll figure out your own thing and what you prefer. You might personally not really like the look of rips and want everything to be quite clean and cut with scissors, so this is just something you'll figure out in time. You'll see in this video that I'm switching between 2 pairs of scissors. I have a tiny pair which I use for obviously little details. They're actually nail scissors, but I've now started using them for collage. I've also been using quite a big pair, the yellow ones. Now the reason I'm using them is because they're actually a little bit stiff, so they're quite hard to use, but I kind of want that because it means I cut more wonky shapes and I quite enjoy a wonky collage. This is all personal taste. You might prefer your collages to look a lot more clean and smooth, but I like it when my art's a little bit wonky. I think it looks quite cute. So yeah, depending on the scissors depends on how the shape looks. Obviously if you use a pair of scissors that's quite difficult to use, you're going to have a wonky shape, so you might want that, you might not. I also have just normal scissors as well, which I use sometimes, but yeah, it just depends what look I'm after. Once I'm happy with how everything's looking, I'll go back in with a glue stick and stick everything down proper, because if you remember I gave everything just a loose quite a loose stick, so all the edges are flapping up. So yeah, went back in and properly stuck everything down, and then it's detail time, which is I think the best bit. I'll go in with pencils and crayons to scribble on top of shapes. You can see I quite like to add white on top of quite dark shapes, so I'll just like scribble on top. You can see I've done that in the sea on that quite dark piece of paper. I've scribbled on top of it with a white crayon. I find this is the best bit. It really brings the collage together. I'll add little windows and doors and slightly change the colours of shapes that I want to change. Yeah, I've been collaging now for nearly around 2 years, and since that point I've slowly been getting more and more obsessed with it, and now it's to the point where it's one of my go-to forms of art. It's like, oh, do I want to do a painting or do I want to do a collage? You know, that's how much I really like it. So I think it's fair to say I've had a lot of practice, so please don't be disheartened if at the start you're struggling with it, because I've been there. I've definitely struggled with collage, and I still struggle with collage, and I will continue to struggle with collage. Sometimes you'll just have a day where all the pieces just go together perfectly, and there'll be other times where you just can't make a nice collage for the life of you. But if you're thinking, oh, I quite like to give collage a go but I'm not quite sure, just go for it. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And yeah, we're getting to the end of the video now. I hope all of this has been helpful and you've enjoyed watching me make this collage, and hopefully I've inspired you to do a collage, because I really enjoy it. If you have been inspired to do a collage, please feel free to send me a picture of it on Instagram or tag me in a post. I'd love to see what you've made. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a lovely day. Goodbye.